Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have us with you today. My name is Kayla, and I work as a project manager at Art Outreach. Welcome to the second edition of Basecamp. This program is a complement to Art Outreach's Summit, which is a professional development workshop designed to support art practitioners in their pursuit of excellence. You'll be hearing more about our programs very shortly. I'm sure you're going to enjoy the presentations and dialogues today. And to start us off, it's my pleasure to introduce Art Outreach's chairman, May Anderson.
Good morning. They tell me that if you want to make a good speech, you start off with some kind of hook or some kind of joke. The joke is last year, this time, I was in bed. This is the second edition. This is the second edition of the Base Camp, so it's my first time speaking. They thought I had died or something, And so yesterday and the days before, they were like, "Are you going to wake up? Are you going to wake up?" I'm 55 years old. I have woken up every day, but thank you, and here I am, right? So I want to tell you a little bit about Art Outreach. It's a local charity, started 23 years ago. We focus on visual arts, and we began with a very strong focus on education, promoting visual literacy, and working primarily with schools, teachers, and young people. And that grounding still matters to us in a very big way. Oh, I didn't bring my clicker up. Can someone click the slides for me? Fantastic. Thank you, Joanne. Always on everything. So over time, our work has evolved. Today, alongside education and public programs, we work across exhibitions, professional development, as well as project management and advisory. And what ties all of this together is the belief that artists do not work in isolation and that strong ecosystems are built through trust, infrastructure, and sustained relationships. One practical outcome of this shift is how we raise funds and deliver impact. So rather than relying on just traditional ways of fundraising, which have their place and which we still do, we also focus on producing meaningful and managing meaningful projects, right? So this allows us to work closely with private and corporate patrons to advise them thoughtfully and to support artists in ways that are both ambitious and responsible. So Singapore Art Week is a very visible example of this approach. And this year, we are involved in multiple projects across the week. Each one is a little bit different in size and scale, but all rooted in collaboration. So crucially, these projects allow artists and their practices to be seen, while also creating very real pathways between artists, curators, institutions, installers, and the many other people who work to make the ecosystem function. So for this is fundraising through doing, through partnerships, and through being useful to the field. Now, please indulge my team and I as I give you a glimpse of what that looks like in practice. So, starting on my left, and in the Gilman Barracks precinct, we have a wonderful presentation by Ang Song Nian called Cut Ground in Our Space. And then we have a pop-up studio and some inflatables across Gilman Barracks by Ants. We have, of course, the wonderful presentation by Ibrahim Mahama, his first solo show in Singapore. And we are the precinct activators with a festival that we call Gather at Gilman, happening tonight. And in the River Valley District, with the Tanoto Art Foundation's beautiful Rituals of Perception, I hope you go see that, along with Kim Association's presentation of Shuang Li. The work is called Alliance. And at the Warehouse Hotel, we also have that wonderful partnership between ArtSG and the Rock Bund Museum that we had the privilege of putting up as well. In the Business District at Bank of Singapore lobby, we feature Charmaine Chen in a beautiful traditional kind of romantic presentation of sign painting. She does gilding in gold. And here at Marina Bay Sands, we have a booth at ArtSG presenting urban artists. And I kind of make a bad joke that we supply child labor to the fair. So we promote working opportunities, learning opportunities by providing fair assistance and gallery assistance. They get paid and they get wonderful exposure. Now, the base camp sits within a broader framework that we call the Art Outreach Summit, as Kayla just said. The summit is our professional development platform designed to support artists and curators at critical points in their practice. It is deliberately small and intensive and conversation driven. I'm very proud to brag of my faculty Joanne, if you will, Alessio Antoniolli, Dr. Zoé Butt, Dr. Suk Kyung Lee, Ho Zin Yen, Dr. Adele Tan, and Dr. Zoé Whitley. They will spend 2 days in a closed professional development workshop with 8 participants selected through an open call taking place this coming Monday and Tuesday. So Basecamp is more open than more open facing counterpart than the summit. So if the summit is about depth, then Basecamp is about gathering. It is a space to listen, to exchange ideas, and to bring together practitioners, patrons, institutions, and thinkers who are all part of our ecosystem. Now, Basecamp would not be possible without the support of our venue partner, Marina Bay Sands, who supports not just Basecamp but also the summit. We also thank our program partner, the Institutum, and Dr. Andreas Teo, its founder. This year, we are also very pleased to thank the French Embassy for their collaboration, and we welcome a wonderful delegation of French art leaders here today, and many thanks to Sylvain Naulin, Francois Lousteau, and of course, Charlene Lim. This brings me to the pièce de résistance, right? The whole reason why we are here today. We are incredibly fortunate to have a strong speaker lineup anchored by an artist whose work many of us have been following very, very closely. Just last evening, if you will, yes, we had the privilege of opening Ibrahim Mahama's exhibition in Singapore in collaboration with the Pierre Lorinet collection. Thank you so much, Pierre. And of course, to your advisor and curator, Edward Mitterrand. We also thank Clementine de la Ferronnière, and we thank, but we're missing Francesco Migliorati. Please send her my warmest regards. We spent yesterday with Ibrahim, and it was immediately apparent that it was not enough. So you are in for a treat. Ibrahim is an artist whose practice is often described in terms of scale, material, and global reach. He works with objects that have already lived many lives: jute sacks, fabrics, paper documents, all remnants of trade and labor. He treats them as neutral materials, but as not as neutral materials, but as witnesses to history. So what struck us through working together, however, is not just the rigor of his thinking, but the generosity of his way of working. He doesn't say no to anything, any request, anything. He just says yes, right? So it feels particularly fitting that he's here with us today, not just as an exhibiting artist, but as a critical voice within a wider conversation about practice, responsibility, and the systems that shape how art is made and encountered. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming an artist whose kind generosity matches the impressive ambition of his works. I give you Ibrahim Mahama.
Good morning. It feels a bit weird with all the phones. Yeah, thank you very much. It's good to be here, and I'm very grateful to um, Clementine here, and then Edward, and also May for such a wonderful presentation yesterday, and also just generally like coming all the way to Singapore in order to be able to share. Um, I guess the work that we've been doing, both intellectually and also on a material level. Yeah, I, I put together this presentation quite very. It wasn't shabbily, but there are a lot of really interesting things in there. But I guess in looking at it, then maybe we can. Yeah, I don't know if many of you know my background as an artist because I studied at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, which is in Kumasi. And it's, the program which I studied in was originally created by the British. So it was quite very conservative for many years. Recently, I was working at the Kochi Biennial, and I had a chance to like work with a lot of students. And I remember telling them that the program, in terms of like how art was being taught, was it reminded me of what art was when I was a student back at the university before there was a shift within it. So there was a really important professor called Caricature who was really interested in this idea of shifting art from the thinking about art from the state of a commodity into a gift. So, of course, before our time, even students were not taught about Venice Biennial or all the other international project documenta and things that were happening. So for caricature, it was really important. And also because we're coming from like this Marxist background, also thinking about Ghana in the post-independence era, thinking about what Ghana meant, especially people like Kwame Nkrumah, in relation to even areas like this, Singapore, Malaysia, China. It was in 1966. Nkrumah traveled to Vietnam for peace mediation, and that's where the overthrow happened. You know, so sometimes we imagine that Nkrumah was the equivalent of the Lee Kuan Yew that we had, and then his life was cut so short. And together, of course, Patrice Lumumba and all these other people. So for us, the question of arts begins with the question of like a certain historical burden, but also with a certain sense of what responsibility. Yeah. So in some of there is a really important work by Alfredo Ja, Be Afraid of the Enormity of the Possible. And for me, I think that it's about the audacity as artists, what we bring to art making and art practice. Yeah. It was very frustrating for many years when I started working because people always said that, oh, your work reminds us of Crystal, you know. Though I think it's quite interesting because when I was a student in school, it was always about the courage that Crystal brought into art making in terms of looking at like art on a certain scale and all that. And also with regards to what art in itself is, because at the end of the day, art is one of those things. It's really important. We need it. But at the same time, if it doesn't exist, the world will keep moving on. But the question is that how will the world keep moving on? You know, in what state will it be in? So I'm really interested in how it's not just about the audacity and the ambitiousness of the projects, but what it brings with itself. And of course, when you're an artist, you have people that you look up to. So people like Fiesta Gates. I remember in 2015 when I was invited by Okwi for the Venice Biennale. At the time, I was so young. I was like 27, 26, 27. And of course, it was not imagined. I was like the youngest artist ever invited to the Venice Biennale. And I was just finishing art school. And I remember when I got the invitation, it was on Facebook. And I thought it was a scam situation. I was like, this is not real. But eventually, I followed up and I was like, okay, fine. It seems like something it's going to happen. And I remember when I was working in the Arsenale, a lot of artists will walk past me and they thought I was, what's the name, an intern or something, you know? And they always stopped and asked me, when is the artist coming? And I said, oh yeah, he will be arriving very soon, you know? But I remember it was only Theaster Gates and Steve McQueen who came to me and said, oh, we really like your work. And there were people, of course, there were people that studied their work in school. So we had these conversations, and I followed up with Theaster later on in Chicago trying to understand what he was doing. But of course, around that time, I was already interested in this idea of expanding my practice on an institutional form. So it was really quite interesting to somehow follow his thinking with regards to what he's been doing in Chicago in the context of America. And of course, a lot of the things that I work with, they stem from this kind of material base and history. In Ghana, we have we will see more of it later. But there's a glass factory that was built in the early 60s. It was built between 1960. It was originally designed in Czechoslovakia, built in Germany, and then installed in Ghana between 1960 and 1965. In 66, it opened, and exactly 19 days after Nkrumah opened it, that's when the coup happened. So a lot of my work also follows with these kind of post-independent promises. Of course, we also have like something as common as a brick. And most of these bricks that you see are materials which are coming from the south. And my studio is all the way in the north. So of course, like when I started building the studio, the question was how to transport what materials. So if you can transport, for instance, a brick, let's say 1 million bricks, in order to be able to build a studio in a public institution, it means that you can transport anything. So it's also the audacity of the material. If you've traveled in Ghana and you've seen the roads, you understand what I'm talking about. Yeah. So the question, it's also about a question of restitution. You know, how do we restitute? But what are we restituting? Because sometimes, like even like when I started building the studio and the space, it was a question of buying land, which public land which had been sold to private individuals, the idea of buying the land back and then making it into a public space. So I started with a small space, and the money that came from it was the first artwork that I sold to the to Charles Saatchi. Yeah, there was a show in London called Pangaea in 2014. So the idea was to invest the money into building a studio. So starting with 2 acres of land, and then gradually convincing my neighbors to sell their land so that we could expand it into a public space, because it's the only public space that you have in that in the whole of the north where I come from, which has about 7 million people. Yeah. So the question was, what are you building with? You know, so it's not just a matter of like getting new things, but it's almost as if we're somehow excavating through this carcass of history in a way, because we have the history of the railway, which was built by the British from the 1890s. And around that same time, you can also think about it in relation to the history of Benin, and then the looting of the Benin bronzes and all that. There are so many things happening within that timeline. The Congo genocide around the rubber plantation is also happening. So again, when you come to Ghana, there are a lot of like these historical spaces and sites like the railway, which have been constantly being like erased. So I go through these processes, and then I acquire back these materials, and then we rebuild them artistically, somehow bringing these memories closer to a different generation. So when you look at the images carefully, you realize that there are some parts where there's this historical image of like the men building the railway in the late 1800s, and then you have working with various characters within like forest areas and others in order to be able to re-excavate these materials and somehow building new forms of institutions with them. There's an interesting, the Thai make like the best horror movies in the world. There's a really interesting horror movie called Shutter, and I think there was both an American and Thai version, but it's about this question of this ghost that is haunting one of the characters, and then it somehow puts this pressure on the spine. And I really like this idea that the materials that we work with, as May was talking about, they are not neutral. They are things that really contain these historical burdens. And also a lot of like, we're not looking for answers per se, but it's like there's a collective inquiry within these materials which we're trying to explore. But I think we cannot talk about what we do without talking about the question of labor. You know, what does labor actually represent? Because the idea of you making work of art as an artist, it's not just a painting or a sculpture, but it's also about the idea that we're building a work that also allows for us to rethink about the question of redistribution. For me, the studio is the work in itself. And I like to think about it again in relation to these forms. Like there's a really interesting painting by Wuslahoma of the Gulf Stream, of this black character on a boat, which is broken. And it almost seems like at any point there are sharks surrounding it, and he could sink. So this question of hope or hopelessness. And then you also have like these engravings of like the transatlantic slave trade, of the throwing of the ships, the slaves overboard into the ocean, versus in the background, again, the Congo genocide of the rubber plantation and how they used to decapitate the hands of like the natives because they couldn't harvest enough rubber and things like that. Yeah, so there's a question of like, there's this very heavy question of debt that we're somehow dealing with. And for me as an artist, I think it's really interesting for us to be able to think about that, because traditionally, as an artist, you'd ask yourself, to what extent does the artist, what's the artist's responsibility? Yeah, because sometimes we think that, oh yes, maybe the museums, the collectors, they will buy the work, they will do this, they'll build a museum. But I said, no, the artist's intent certainly is different from an institution's intent. Yeah, so it's also a question of how the artist positions themselves within the context that they find themselves. Of course, back to the materials, so looking at like the bags that I work with and how these bags have all these tattoos on them, which are they are steeped in these histories that I'm talking about. Both the British colonial maps, the cartographies of it, and also how that influences, let's say, the aesthetics of these materials. I think when the railway was originally built, it was built for the transportation of the cocoa to the port, to where the boats were. But due to the contamination from the sea, the British decided to build a railway to this area where they built a port. The first port that was built in Ghana was opened in 1924, and it was the Takoradi Harbour. And so these are some of the historical images of the light railway, together with the jute packs that were pushed slowly to the coast. And so again, it was always about this question of extraction. So ours is more or less about how to move from the extraction into like thinking about this gift. So you realize that maybe I might go into market spaces, negotiate with women and men, collecting objects, as broken as they are, because we are thinking about the intrinsic value within what? The materials that we're working with. Yeah. And it was in the beginning, it wasn't very smooth. These women, they were very suspicious of me because it's not every day that you meet a student who is like finishing his master's degree and coming to the market to collect materials. And these materials are very important to them because they use it again and again and again and again. To a point, they write their names on it. The material gets torn. They use part of their clothes to restitch the material. So it's almost like an extension of their body in themselves. So if you ask them for the material, as broken as it is, they feel like they're giving you a part of themselves. So when they agreed, they will help me to exchange. So I would go to the warehouses and buy new materials, bring it to the markets, and then they will go around and give it to all the women to take their old broken bags. And that's how I started. But it was also about thinking about the traces of the commodities that were left within it. And there is this building in the western region of Ghana. It's called the Secondary Locomotive Workshop. It was built in 1900s, thereabouts, 1900. And it was the largest railway repair workshop in the whole of West Africa, I think sub-Saharan Africa. And the main reason why it was built was so that it could keep the railway running, so the British could extract more. And as a student, I used to go there quite a lot, just trying to understand the architecture, and also the question of work and the history of labor coming from this place. Of course, I'm very much interested in the writings of Arundhati Roy. And there is a text, there's a quote from her from one of her famous texts, which she says that the dead is living and the living are dead people pretending. Because sometimes when things are old, we like to think that, oh, those things are somehow broken, but they are much more a better reflection of the world that we live in than the so-called polished world that we like to see. And there's a Ghanaian filmmaker, Nick Kwate Owu. He makes this really beautiful film about the British Museum and some of the objects that were looted, which are within the archives, which you never see anyway. So for me, it's also this question of the restitution. But we cannot talk about the question of restitution without talking about distribution and redistribution. In Ghana, when Nkrumah became president, he built a factory called the Food Distribution Corporation. And of course, at the time, it was in connection with, because Ghana, because of socialist position at the time, were connected to the Eastern Bloc. So Poland, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. We also was part of the non-alliance movement, so certainly also looking towards India and the East, Southeast Asia. And the Food Distribution Corporation was meant for food processing. But in 66, again, when Nkrumah was overthrown, all these projects were completely abandoned, never completed. And we as artists, we're not thinking about it just as the question of distribution. The question is how to think about what? Redistribution, because sometimes you can take something and then you can redistribute it again. So sometimes, for instance, I like this image, these two images of the building of the railway in the early 1900s, and the same materials that we've re-excavated. And then sometimes when we are building it as a sculpture, land art, or whatever in the studio, we're inviting the school kids to come and witness the building of this. Because art is not certainly about just making a sculpture and putting it in a gallery, but sometimes it's also about what happens, the question of the witnessing around the form. So I like to think that it's almost like some kind of an archaeological work, but we are not excavating, but what we're rather doing is that we are burying, and it's part of this kind of ideological thing. And you find that the teachers in the rural communities, of course, they're very inspiring. Some of them, when they're being posted to villages, they don't like to go. But those that go there, they're really committed, and sometimes they have to contribute their salaries into buying uniforms for the kids. Because I remember when we would take buses to bring the kids to the studio to see art, contemporary art for the first time, some of the teachers before, they didn't want certain students to join the bus. because they say that, oh, these students don't represent our school very well because their parents are very poor. They don't have, their uniform has holes in the butt and in it, so you can see their butt or whatever. And we always told them, if these are the only kids that you brought to the studio, it will be more, it will be more successful, because at the end of it, and you always realize that when they come, those students that maybe they came from very precarious positions, they were the most inquisitive ones. They were the ones that asked the most questions and all that. Whereas sometimes when we had schools from private schools, they would arrive in the air-conditioned buses. It's almost as if they were coming from a cold store or something. They're so iced up. And then they were on their phones the whole time when they were walking around. So that question of inquisitiveness also wasn't really there. So you realize that here, the most interesting thing is about their uniforms. Their uniforms seem very big, but it's because when the teachers buy the uniform for them, it's a gift for life. They can't buy it for them twice, so they have to wear it for a long time. So again, the question of the gift is very interesting. So our professor from the university, caricature, who's been, I think, arguably one of the most important artists in our country's history. He's the one that has somehow orchestrated this kind of radical pedagogy in terms of thinking about like how we think about different bodies within history and all that. And some of the work, of course, if we're talking about gift redistribution, then it goes to architecture, because this is one of the buildings also built back in the day, in the 60s, which was completely abandoned, the silo. And the idea is that if you as an artist, you are selling a work of art on the art market, what do you do with the money? Because for me, the money is also what's capital. It's part of the material that we work with. So for instance, reinvesting the money into buying a building that is state-owned, but is not publicly accessible, and then buying it from a private point of view and then making it back into a public space. But again, because if I'm coming from the background of painting, what does painting have to do with excavating like an old building or an old site and then giving it this new life? So, but it's basically comes down to the question of repair, I imagine, because in Ghana we have these shoe shine boys, and then they have these boxes which they use it to repair things. And I think that it's quite interesting to think that an object which seems so small, which has like tools in it, could actually inspire us to think about how we can think about a larger question of repair. And I was, some years ago, I was at a Prado and I saw this painting by Francesco Goya, which I thought was quite interesting. The question of cultural genocide has always been quite interesting to me. In Ghana, we have a lot of like really interesting buildings, archives, which constantly are being erased, being erased, being erased. And I remember when I became interested in the railway, the first train, I was a student, but I couldn't get access to it until 10 years later. And the first train that I got, it was cut into pieces. And the idea was to find the people that cut it into pieces, pay them, so they would weld the train back together again. Because now the train becomes something more than just what it was, because it also now bears the mark of the idea of the erasure and then bringing it back to life, which, also, of course, it also makes me think about the work of William Kentridge in this sense. So you find that in some cases, we might have the train that we are trying to repair, and then we also have the bag, the stitches on the bag, the repair. So for me, those two things are the same. Yeah, so the question of repair is not just specific to a certain specific material form, but we can look at it in many different forms. And even sometimes when we go to collect these trains that I have bought, which are packed in the most impossible spaces to get access to. I remember in this case, we had to, it was impossible to get the train because it had been packed there for 20-something years. And like 2 generations, I think some people had been born even inside the train because people were renting it. But you couldn't get access to it because in this part of the market. And in that area, you have a lot of like drug addicts within the area. Because in Accra, the train station, the train comes to park in the morning, and then it goes in the night again, I think. So people normally sleep under the train, or they sell on the train tracks and all that. So they reorganize themselves. And I remember going there and then talking to them and said, oh, yeah, we need, because we couldn't get access to it, so we need to rebuild this railway line. So what we did was that there were some rail lines that were there that were not used. So we had to like physically excavate them and rebuild a new track. And then the men had to use like a physical manpower to lift the train and then put it on the new track. And we had to push it all the way to carry it. But I like, because these guys, because they're normally smoking weed, their imagination is already up in the cloud, you know. So before I could imagine, when I went there, I said, "Oh, we want this." They said, "Oh, don't worry, we got you sorted." They're already on cloud 10. And yeah, so these are some of the early images of the installation with the bags. Again, back, and this is where my interest in the railway comes in. So this is in 2013. And yeah, of course, we have Alessio here. My first residency was in Gasworks in London. And it was very significant. I remember back then. I remember when I went to London, the second day only, we went, there was a man that used to work at Robert, was it? No, Rohan. Rohan, yes. Yeah, he took me to the ICA to see it, to listen to a talk. And it was like the first professional, like intellectual talk I went to. And it was Zoé Whitley and then Christian Eyene. So, and I remember we're also young back then, Yeah. I remember so vividly, but it was quite interesting. So most of this is around that same period. And all of these were experiments that I was doing during my master's period when I was a student. And this was 10 years ago, the National Theatre. They were built by the Chinese for Ghana in 92 as a gift. And I think recently they gave some money for the repair of the building. So again, if you think about it in relation to like the politics of Africa, China and Ghana, Africa, it's all steeped inside the installation. But I also like this idea of working with people. In the case of this, trust me, if Christo had grown up in Ghana, he would have gotten projects done in a much shorter period, instead of waiting for 35 years to get permission. It's a different sense of negotiation here when we're doing these projects in Ghana. So for instance, the Barbican, I write a proposal to the stadium, and I'm like, I want to use the stadium because you're renting the football teams are paying. So I also pay and use it as a ground because I was also really interested in like mapping out the material in terms of what we're doing. So we hired like 1,500 people. So every 2 or 3 days, we go to the stadium just to engage in the sewing. And I really like this idea that it gave us this really big panoramic quality. So we had to divide the work because it's almost as if you're making a garment for a larger body in a way. And I think that for me, this is not their work. Because here you have a lot of the women and the men coming in with their kids sitting on it. Sometimes their kids are even peeing on the work as you. So I remember I got into trouble in London when I said, oh, the material had pee on it. And people were like, how can you bring pee into London? And I was like, guys, relax. 400 years, you did so many terrible things. This is the least. This is the least of things. This is the least that you can expect. Yeah, so I also like the idea that in thinking about this larger thing that we're working with, it's not just the physical buildings, but of course, we're talking about the trains, but why not planes also? So working with like different people across different spaces and sites, the railway workers excavating these objects which would be ordinarily destroyed, moving them across different spaces. But again, what does it mean to move these objects? Because when you're moving them with what? History. They're witnessing time. And then people are also witnessing them. Because sometimes when you're moving these objects, there are school kids who are seeing this and for the first time, and we're working with like the man in the corner here. He's the electrician that we work with at the studio. He's the one doing the electrical wires. But at the same time, when we're transporting these, we also need someone who can disconnect the high tension so the plane can go underneath it. Yeah, so it's also this question, and we're working with the police, with the army. So you have to find ways of sometimes using the state apparatus in order to be able to do the things that the imagination of the state cannot stretch to. And it's interesting how, like, when we're doing it, so I have my drone and I'm photographing, filming. Sometimes my assistants are doing it. And it's always interesting how the community around it, especially the kids, they're always so curious and they really want to see what it is in terms of what this means. Yeah, so basically like just looking at this question of transportation and also how these objects, they just become like playgrounds. So we're talking about the ghost and all the heavy things, but at the end of the day, it just becomes what? A playground for different kinds of things. Teaching, using it as my wife is a chef, so sometimes when we host people, we do like these fine dining in the airplane. and things like that. So we were using, well, I was very serious, like, oh, we're teaching drone, blah, blah, blah. My wife came in and said, well, we should just eat in the airplane, you know? I said, okay, yes, boss, let's do it. Yeah, so I also like that, we come back to the question of the scar. So again, Caravaggio's doubting Thomas in terms of looking at the scar on the body of Christ in relation to the scars on the objects, the archives, the land, again, how if in the quest of redistribution, that question of doubt and how we are able to like bridge that gap and all that, because when we bring it there, there's an interesting photo of Nkrumah up there. This is a photo of Nkrumah when he got news that he had been overthrown in Ghana. This was in Vietnam in 1966, on 24th February. Yeah. So you'll see that I'm really interested in like different like artistic work within history, and then I might use that in thinking about it in relation to how we also reassemble these bodies, both architecturally and also mechanically and all that. And we're back to caricature as an astronaut with Nkrumah, and then you have the railway line, which if you think about the photographs of people like even Malik Sidibe and others, like we also have James Bano, the great Ghanaian photographer, and the idea of the studio photography. You go to the studio, you sit. Sometimes there's a railway station or a plane in the background, and you pretend that you're climbing the plane. Yeah, but the idea that this time around, the carcass of the railway becomes the space, which somehow it reframes even like families coming to take like family photos and things like that. So it's also the question of the memory and how that functions. And all these images should not exist because all these trains were marked for demolition. And I remember there is an engine, which you see slightly in the background. When the dam in Ghana wasn't built before 1962, all the electricity in Ghana was actually powered by train engines. Yeah. So when I bought some of these trains, the engines were still in them. And the idea is to find ways in which we can use this engine also, these engines to somehow create a new energy system for the institution. But again, if we stick to the witnessing, the idea of like production, artistic production, so we're making work in the studio. And then you have the kids ordinarily in the community, we're assembling these sculptures, which are made up of trains that are cut into pieces. So the question is that between the last 100 years, so much has changed. The same materials that were brought to Ghana is the same materials now that we've somehow re-excavated, and then we're presenting as a new gift in terms of reimagining what a different future can be. And I think that we, as artists, when we sometimes bring courage into art, it inspires other people to also be courageous in other ways. So for instance, the tuk-tuk driver who would come to the space and then be so inspired that he will go home and stop work and bring all the kids in his house. And imagine all these 15 kids. I don't even think in India they do this, because we always think that India is very notorious because all of these mechanics are coming from India. But he puts all of them, he stuffs them. It's almost as if he's shrinking the universe back into an atom. And then he puts wood in it just to prevent them from falling out. So he's still kind, And I think the kids are even like the most courageous to go in this journey just to be able to see art. And we also have sometimes we have a caretaker, Zachariah. And what he does is that when I started building this in 2014, we encountered him in the community because it was a farming community which I bought the land. And he's helping us to build the space, contributing his labor. But I also think that it's quite interesting in terms of when we have school kids coming on tours. There was an exhibition that we hosted, which was in collaboration with the Aarhus Museum in Denmark. And we had different loans of different works. And one of the really interesting works that we had was a work by Olafur Eliassen. And Zachariah is a farmer, typically. So again, when the kids come, for me, it's also very interesting to think there's no division of labor. Because I always get frustrated with how when you travel around the world, especially with Western institutions, like you have the security, and most times the security, they are minorities. When you're even black and you go inside, and the way they watch you, it's almost as if you're there to cause trouble. Because most often, you find that the majority of the audience are middle-class white people. And you always ask yourself, why is it that the kids in Brixton, the black kids, why is it that you don't find them going to the museum? So the question is about the structure, And the idea that even at Red Clay, sometimes when people just come in the middle of the night, the security can open the space, and then they can already start looking at the work, or they can be engaged in it. So it's about that question of like transfer of labor. So we saw this already. So again, these are the railway workers. So again, bringing the railway workers back into this question of the building. And some of the works which I've done, a recent work at the Kunsthalle Wien. And I was really interested in these headpans which are being used and also like the body of like forms in it. Again, these are the images of the men under the trains. And that's where the idea came from. And thinking about this, making these drawings of like all these headpans which are used in the market spaces for carrying really heavy objects, and thinking about it in relation to like the weight of the train in terms of like these historical forms. And again, back to the studio in terms of like the organization of these objects and how school kids are navigating it whilst we're producing the work at the same time. What does it mean? And again, doing these collages of like thinking about the assemblage and all that. And this was the image in the how it turned out in the Kunsthalle Vienna. And we also had these X-rays of like the spines of like the different women in the market spaces and all that, thinking about the weight again in relation to like the railway history and all that. And this is a very special project. So this is a project that we're working on for the Cartier in this year coming up. And this is a glass factory which was built. Again, it was the largest glass manufacturing company in Africa, which was abandoned some years ago, and it was sold as scrap. So again, I went into the factory. There was like 300,000 bottles of glass abandoned. And then when I was young, my mother used to sell like minerals, like Coke, Fanta, and things like that. And I was really thinking about, because this factory, they were cutting it into pieces, but the idea was to negotiate and then recollect the factory and then reassemble it as a sculpture or whatever. But again, I'm thinking about it in relation to even like characters like Lumumba, and Lumumba was assassinated around the same time when this factory was being conceived. Yeah. So these are the images. So working again with labor within these spaces, collecting these materials and transferring them all the way to the studio, like treating the glass bottles the same way as you treat, let's say, the bricks or the trains or things. So it's a question of care. How do you move like this fragile object? It's almost like an egg from within, let's say, a 1,000 kilometer space, or taking it all the way to Paris to rebuild, like, for instance. So when we took it to the studio, it was quite interesting. And these glass, they were done in a very different period. You can even walk on them, you know, so the density of material which is within them. I really like some of the, so these are some of the collages, drawings that I make, like looking at like different characters, especially, again, coming from the African continent, in terms of like some people who've like really made quite intellectual contributions to rethinking about some of these conversations. And sometimes, yeah, so these are like, so for instance, again, when you were bringing these objects there, the question of witnessing, yeah, so you have it like in a studio, and it's just there, it's like raw material. But at the end of the day, it goes beyond the question of the raw material in terms of what it does. So there are so many different things. I cannot talk about all of them, but like this is even like a remnants from like this rubber factory also within the period, which in the show that we have at the Gilman, the materials is coming from that. But you see that even when we're building these spaces, this is the same space. We're even inviting again the kids to come and witness the building. Because in 30 years, you never know, some of these kids might become the next ministers of culture or whatever. So again, it's almost as if we're also implanting this form of like, they're witnessing the birth of the institution as part of their upbringing. And again, the glass factory. So we have the glass and then we grow corn or whatever on it. So thinking about all the things that seem really paradoxical, it doesn't make any sense. And the relationship between, let's say, a vegetation growing on top of this in relation to inviting the school kids to walk on top of this material. So these are some drone images of it. And so now it becomes, it's not like the white cube. So it presents a very different way that we look at art, artistic production. So we staged, in the studio, we have all these things that we staged. So in Ghanaian arts, there were a lot of artists who made scenes of the markets. So they have all these market scenes. But I think when you go to the markets, of course, they're selling goats, they're selling tomato, yam, and that's where my work comes from. But you can also make abstract compositions. So for instance, bring in the food from the market and just placing it on top of the glass, because now you're looking at it from a very different position. And maybe from a human perspective, you might not see it the same way as from a drone. Again, back to the question of freedom and liberty, thinking about it in relation to like this kind of instantaneous way of thinking of building a studio, but also thinking that at the same time, the work that we make, because it is inscribed with this idea of the collective labor and history, it should be part of the landscape. So a lot of the work that I do, I think about 90% of the work I've done in my entire life, it's all given to this public trust that I created. Because it's very frustrating, honestly, coming from Africa, and sometimes you never see the works of African artists on the continent, or even in Asia and other places. And that's why we talk about the responsibility of the artists. So again, whilst we're thinking about the building, we're also thinking about the redistribution at the same time. And the redistribution is in it. I like the idea of like how in London you can take the tube and go and see the exhibition. But in Tamale, some of the kids who want to come, they can't. So they in this photograph, they had to do like a marathon. They had to run 40 kilometers just to come and see contemporary art for the first time. If we asked you to go anywhere 40 kilometers to see art, no, you won't do it. Yeah. So the question of courage. So again, the question of redistribution. So between a foreign audience, a local audience, kids, the idea of like inhabiting a work of art, sitting on the desk, in a question of, let's say, this was at the White Cube, it's an object. Of course, art functions in different forms. If you break something in a museum, the museum feels liable. But in the artist studio, it's different. If it breaks, it's our job to repair it, you know. So I like this kind of freedom that it comes with and how we can exercise that freedom within the question of the studio. And also how, like, even the objects can function differently. When the kids are in the studio, we can take the artwork, they can lie inside the artwork. And these are objects which I bought from Greece, from the Second World War. So they have the trauma, they have blood and other things on it. But remember the First and Second World War, a lot of the soldiers that fought in the war were either coming from Asia, Southeast Asia, or coming from West Africa. Yeah, so connecting those dots through the forms. And again, we have even just the brick, laying the brick on the floor. And then these are workshops, inviting the kids. So they're not coming to see the painting on the wall, but they're coming to witness the building of something. And I think it's a question of, it's a question of faith and courage in a way. Because when we're growing up in Ghana, I never saw contemporary art. I never saw, like, the closest you could see was to go to the art center where you could see some crafts and other things, you know. So the Parliament of Ghosts is one of the projects that we worked on also. It was originally conceived for the Withworth Art Gallery in Manchester, and then subsequently expanded into like this architectural form. We have two versions at the moment, one at Kochi and one in London at the Ibras. So again, you can see that we're building the space whilst we're using it as a classroom at the same time. So that kind of instantaneous thing. And then also we transform it into a cornfield. So what does it mean for this kind of transformation? The same people who are coming to the studio to see the work of art, sometimes you're also employing some of them in order to be able to produce that same contemporary attitude that we're looking for. Or taking that attitude to a faraway village where you have to cross like 5 rivers with a canoe, with a TV screen in order to go and show kids, let's say, work. Or even just like working with general compositions within the studio, using the studio as a repair, like repairing the objects which we're using there at the same time. So these are just examples. And I like how the women in the community, like, they always come with like all their kids on one motorbike and all that. And it's really quite interesting. Like, they take it very seriously. They're very proud of it. They wear their best clothes when they're coming. And then they even put their kids in different parts of the objects, and then they make their own photos and all that. Yeah. And also like the different women in the communities who come there to sell fruits and other things. Sometimes when they see that there's a large crowd, they just follow them around. And then sometimes when they're tired, they just put the fruits on the artwork, you know? And I really like that. In a museum, you cannot do that. And historically, these women will be painted and hanged in the museum. But that was a frustration, that there was a disconnect between the subject and then the institutional form that was around it. And we have a really beautiful photograph by James Barno in the background. It was part of a retrospective that we did last year, or was it last year or 3 years ago already? Yeah. And we had one of these works that was also composed within this space. And it's not just for human beings. So we also have like chickens, and we have like ducks, we have goats. So sometimes you come and then like there are chickens walking around the installation, and some of them, they are even laying eggs inside the boxes because that's where they feel safe, because the snakes cannot swallow their eggs or something. And we also have bats living in between the space. And then so I think this is the last image. Yeah. So what you have to remember is that all of this that we're talking about is coming from a specific, very precarious history. So again, how do we excavate this kind of precarity and the density of history? Because sometimes people say, oh, history is so difficult to deal with and we should just leave it and then go. No. But then you cannot build a future without a certain tangible history. And I think that is also very important politically in terms of thinking about all these problems that we have in the world, looking at what is happening in America today, skip it to the Middle East, thinking about the Gaza-Israel situation and all that. So all these histories are things that we have to deal with if we're really interested in somehow gifting a different generation with a different perspective and a different way of thinking about life. Because after all, if we can somehow resurrect the dead, and then we can build new forms out of it, then what can't we do for the future? Yeah. So I guess I'll leave it there. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mahama. I'm sure everyone agreed that that was incredibly insightful. And what's even better is that we get to hear more from you, but only after you've had a drink. And may I invite you to remain on stage and please take a seat. I now have the privilege of introducing your fellow panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, we now begin our second half of our panel conversation. Our panel is themed Placemaking, Artist-Centered Spaces in a Changing World. To moderate the conversation, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Zoé Whitley to join us on stage. Dr. Zoé Whitley is an award-winning curator and writer based in London. She was the director of Chisenhale Gallery and has previously held curatorial roles at the Tate, the Victoria, Albert Museum, and Hayward Gallery. Her work centers on contemporary art, visual culture, questions of representation, and she lectures internationally. Dr. Whitley comes to us just after a very successful launch of the 5th edition of Desert X Alula in Saudi Arabia last week, where she participated as curator of this stunning arts festival. Joining the panel next, please welcome Ms. Antonia Scintilla. Ms. Scintilla is director of Fondation Pernod Ricard in Paris, a leading platform for contemporary artistic experimentation and dialogue. With extensive experience in cultural philanthropy and institutional leadership, she has been central to shaping programs that support artists, curators, and critical discourse beyond traditional collection models. I'd now like to invite Mr. Alessio Antoniolli to the stage to round off this impressive group.
Oh, thank you.
Mr. Antoniolli is director of Triangle Network, a global network of artist-run spaces spanning more than 40 countries. Formerly director of Gasworks London for over 25 years. He has played a pivotal role in supporting international artistic exchange, particularly for artists from the Global South. He also serves as a curator and advisor to institutions across Europe. Thank you, everyone, and if you're comfortable, I will turn things over to Dr. Whitley.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to have such a huge gathering of people. We know that that is primarily because of Ibrahim. Thank you so much for what you've just shared with us about your practice over what is actually not a very long career when you think about it, from 2013, but so deep and so substantial. And initially, when I put together some prompts and questions for us to think about, this notion of placemaking felt like maybe a capacious enough net for us to then discuss from lots of different points of view. I wanted to give you a chance to catch your breath, but so much of what you've said really leads to thinking about how each of us show up in the world creatively, courageously, and I appreciated that one of the points you ended on was, and that was a through line throughout the presentation, was this notion of thinking and looking at things from a different position. And each of our panelists, you know, the thing that kind of joins everyone together is leading mission-driven spaces. And I think there's value in using a public platform like this for us to think about how we each balance that sense of visioning something big, but also then fine-tuning that detail. And in a week like ArtSG, there is a sense that some people are looking to think about how they start their careers, how they continue them. And so, you know, fundamentally, there's this balance between how we think about theory and practice. So what I was hoping to do is for us to balance both asking individual questions to you, and then there can be some group questions, and there may well be time for questions from the floor. But I thought, Antonia, if I start with you, you were brought on as the director of Fondation Pernod Ricard to foster, you know, in some senses, a creation of conviviality. So it's the nonprofit and, you know, public-facing cultural arm of a much bigger conglomerate that specializes in, you know, a range of products. And businessman Paul Ricard started that foundation in 1998. But I think we'll come on to you and the three institutions that you've founded. But I wanted to start with you about what that means to enter into a foundation or something that exists, and how you then put your own mark on it.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. Thank you also, Ibrahim, from this very inspirational presentation. I'm very happy to be here today. It's my first time in Singapore, and I have to say that the city itself is kind of sort of placemaking of history and resource and migration. So, and I'm discovering it. So, going back to the Fondation Pernod Ricard, as you said, it was established in 1998. What is very particular in the history of the foundation that it was created by Paul Ricard, and for the record, he was an artist himself. And he attended the art school in Marseille, where he was born. And at some point, he had to drop school and go back to work for the family firm, building the group, the worldwide group that we know today. But all his life, he considered himself as an artist. And he painted all his life, and he was there. He never collected. He was really there to support the artists in their creation process, in the making, being there for them, also in a kind of like way of experimenting their work. And it was not just in the arts, because he also established an oceanographic institute studying the Mediterranean, which is still operating in the south of France. And so this is where all it started, really related to this very idea to be there to support the artists in a long way journey, in a long term relationship. And so the foundation was created in 1998, so almost 30 years ago. And we have a kind of like special model, like unique model, at least in France, because we don't have any collection. So the idea is really to operate like a platform to support the artists, the curators, the authors we work with. And the idea is that every project for me kind of like a collective journey together. And basically there are three main pillars we try to follow, is that to give the person, the ecosystem we work with, and we are also part of, time to build project, of course economic support, and try to create a platform of intellectual discourse. So we have, of course, an exhibition space that is in Paris, in Salazar. But what is important for me, for the foundation, is not the physical venue, it's like to hold a space for discussion, for dialogue. So usually we engage with artists, with curators on project on 1-2 years, like production and making. And what we do is also that for every project, we invite also an external curator to work with us to bring a new vision, a new discourse on the practice, and we focus on emerging art. This is also something that when I took over the direction 3 years ago, I wanted to question, because the question of emergency, emerging artists, because it's always related to being a question of age. And for me, it's more when a practice need to be supported, need to be to receive from an institution this kind of visibility. It's not just related to the age or the stage of your career. And so what we do, we support the artists in their work. What is also very important is all that the support that we give to the artists of the curators. If we produce work, then the works, they belong to the artists. We never recover. We make this choice to never recover production or collect works. And another important part is pillar is our editorial program, because I think that it is also important to bring vision to this scene in France, because we're mainly focused on the emerging art scene in France. So what we do is that we develop also a platform where we invite international curators to write on a practice or artists that are based in France, not just French. And of course, the mission has not changed. We really focus on supporting this scene in France, but the institution itself had to evolve over the years. And just giving one quick example of a major change in our program, we created a prize in 1998 also, which was the first prize to be created in France to support artists. And we had this prize for 25 years, which was a very important prize with a special collaboration with the Centre Pompidou. So every year we put on a show, inviting a curator, a group show, and then the jury selected the winner of the prize. And the prize was to buy, the foundation would buy a work to the winner that then enters the collection of the museum. And 2 years ago, we decided to step away from a kind of like system of putting the artists in competition together, or just one off event of visibility, and we wanted to create a more sustainable way to support the artists. So we launched a new program, and now what we do is that we have 3 artists that we engage a journey with. So we invite a curator, we choose 3 artists together. We think they need visibility and support at that time. And the exhibition is just the starting point, and then we also engage a critical discourse, and we produce for each one of them a project in the 1 or 2 years later. So this was, very interesting also evolution as an institution for us.
I think that's an important aspect to think about, that even in an artist-centered or mission-driven context, that the mission can be something that evolves and changes. Just because it's something was done one way doesn't mean that's the only way to do it. So Ibrahim, if you've caught your breath, my next question is for you. And I've always been interested in the fact that in another context, you've spoken about how artists are trained to produce art, but not necessarily to interrogate it. And in that respect, I think it's important to acknowledge that even within the images that you're showing us, you've set up not even 1 or 2, but 3 different organizations in Ghana. So there's Red Clay Studio, there's also Nkrumah Waleni, and then there's also the SCCA. So what I wanted to ask you more about, not that, because I think you've definitely left us wanting more, is to really delve into more about how the rest of us in the audience might be able to think about developing the interrogative tools that can help reshape the context for making art, but also for what it means to even conceive ideas for these new institutional memories, new institutional possibilities.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. No, certainly. For me, when I started working on these ideas in school, like because it's like when you're studying in school and like you learn that you cannot destroy matter, but you can only transfer it from one state to the other, you know. Um, yeah, so a lot of like objects that I turn to collect are objects that have they've somehow absorbed a lot of different like memories and bodies within them. Yeah. And yeah, starting from that point, I remember when we were students, we used to see these paintings that were done by some of our predecessors. Because I think back there was a period in the 80s in Ghana where there was famine and like shortage of materials. And a lot of artists used to like take the same bags that I work with and then they would stretch them on canvases and they'll make paintings on top of them. And I think it was one of the things that to pay attention to, the idea that sometimes there are certain forms which already, that is it, it's already done, you know. As an artist, it's just a matter of somehow creating the right context for it. It's within that context that somehow we can somehow rethink about it. And that's where the interrogation comes in. So for me, the studios and all those things became part of this language and conversation. So starting to build SCCA, and then thinking, oh, we don't have spaces for doing retrospectives for artists. Why don't we dedicate it as a retrospective space? It's an artist studio, but it's also a space that can become anything. After all, some of the factories that I'm buying in other places, the states will say that, okay, we have an old building, like the turbine, the Tate Hall, Tate. It's like, oh, it's an old power plant station. What do we do with it? We build a contemporary art institution. Whereas there are certain places where it will just never happen. Yeah, so the artist has to be able to think about if you, of course, like in the factory, the glass factory, which I'm building for the Cartier, you can take that material and then build, let's say, a work of art. But at the same time, when you build this sculpture, which is architectural, you can also inhabit it. So it means that it might be a work of art, like red clay, like the silo and others, but it also means that other things can also come into it. And I think it also brings about a certain level of sensitivity. And that's where even the silo, or recently I bought this old colonial, it was the first building that the British built in the north of Ghana. And it was abandoned for so many years. And recently they were selling it. So I negotiated and bought up the building and the land so we could preserve it. Because there's a lot of, during the colonial and the slavery period, a lot of the slaves were taken from the very north of the country and then all the way to the south before they were even taken to the Americas. But when people come to Ghana from the diaspora to trace their history, like African Americans, it's always about go to the slave forts. They're like, oh yes, this is where our ancestors came from. I said, why? They were not born in the castle. They came from somewhere, you know? So again, like what does it mean to be able to, for instance, take this old building? And then if you, for instance, make it into like a space and an artist has to make a work for it or even respond to it, then it means that it already comes with a certain level of criticality. Whereas maybe before, the artist would just make their painting in their studio. And they're just waiting for someone to tell them that, oh, there is a hotel which is organizing an exhibition. Bring whatever paintings you have and let's go and hang it. And I think that's where we transitioned. And that's why it opened up this floodgates where we're like, okay, fine. Now we know that it is possible. We can think in this way. We can think in that way. So how do we build something that certainly provides a new ground for a new, different thinking for another generation to come?
That leads perfectly onto my question for you, Alessio, because in your capacity as director of Triangle Arts Network, then there is this wonderful lattice across the world of interconnected artist-run spaces, artist residencies. But again, there is this sense of in each context, there are very different parameters. And so I would love for you to tell us more about Triangle, but also with a view to a secondary question that has to do with what it means to have to navigate these different informal structures that can sometimes be stronger than the existing ones, but that you fundamentally will have to keep adapting and not to impose a certain model that is one size fits all.
Thank you, Zoe. Also, phenomenal talk. Thank you so much, Ibrahim. It was very moving hearing you speak, Ibrahim, because we met 12 years ago, and it's been such a stratospheric sort of development, and it's very inspiring. And I'm saying that because if I think of the beginning of Triangle, which was told to me because Triangle started in 1982, the whole idea of the network was about listening to artists, because the Triangle Network was set up by a British philanthropist called Robert Loder, but it was developed in conversation with an artist, Anthony Caro, celebrated 20th century sculptor, who at that time was teaching at Central St. Martin's, which is an art school in London. And the conversation between Anthony and Robert was really around need. And it was about the fact, Anthony was saying, when artists finish university, then there's a void. There's nothing that kind of holds them together to get into the next stage of their development. And it's such a precarious time, because it's the time when you don't know what you're doing, your family's pressuring you to do things. There aren't really institutions that can hold you in a way that allows you to develop as an artist. You go from education to a period of production, and that's kind of the mode in which you're in. But artists need to talk to each other. Artists need to be able to be around other artists, because that's the whole point of learning. And literally, that's exactly how Triangle started. It was literally a summer camp. The first one was in upstate New York in 1982. And it brought together artists from the US, Canada, and the UK, which is why very uninspiring.
I was going to say that's a small triangle.
It's a very small triangle and very uninspiring name. Yeah. So, and that's how it started. It was literally a summer camp, and the conditions were that a bunch of artists, I mean like 22 artists from these three corners, would spend 2 weeks together, make work, and at the end of it, the work would be disposed, literally trashed. And the idea of that was really to resist production so that you could focus on process. So the idea of having artists making something not for the end, but for the journey. Because the journey is where artists would talk to one another, learn from each other. There's been a lot of talk in recent years about informal learning, but that's kind of what it was, is literally learning from each other. And to answer a little bit of your second question at the already, is it was also about making do with what's around you. So it was the first workshop was in a farm, and it was literally using the material that they could find around the farm, and just liberating artists from the object meant that experimentation would be so meaningful and continuing their practice after the workshop. Fast forward a few years, the success of this 2 weeks workshop was such that they decided to invite artists from different parts of the world. So kept the name but lost the shape very quickly. They invited 2 artists from South Africa, Bill Ainsley and David Koloane, who were so inspired by this model that they brought it back to South Africa in a completely different context. So upstate New York, downtown Johannesburg, and it retained very much this idea of bringing artists together. But we're talking about South Africa during apartheid. The first workshop was in 1985. And the fact that it was about need and it was so removed from institutions meant that they could do things that an institution in South Africa couldn't do because of the laws. So all of a sudden, these workshops would be filled with women, men, black, white, PhD students, self-taught artists, because the whole thing that brought them together was making something with the idea of learning from each other. And that was like the beginning of the spread of the network, because of course, in a place where the infrastructure was even less than, say, upstate New York, the need for artists to find spaces that weren't institutional, where experimentation was paramount, became so important. And also, it connected very much with the region. There was, just an anecdote at that time, a lot of artists, a lot of people didn't want to go to South Africa. They were boycotting South Africa because of the apartheid. So they decided to do a workshop in Zimbabwe. And from there, it really spread. And it spread again because of a need. So it was artists participating in a workshop, going back home as far as Ghana, Atakwame, Castro, taking this model back home and then kind of making it fit in your own context. And that's the beauty of it. And it goes, briefly answering your second question, Triangle is the opposite of a Starbucks. Starbucks looks the same wherever you go. It's the same, coffee, the same logos. Triangle, and this is also one of the reasons why when I say to people that I run Triangle, they were like, what is it? And it's like, you probably know the organizations that are part of the network, because the network is just sort of like, it's literally like a bit of a portal. It's like a connection. But what you see is the points in the network. So it just really reflects what the local need is. So the principles are the same, is giving artists an opportunity to be around each other and also interact with those from other parts of the world. Because, the whole idea of the network is to think, artists don't think in isolations, but community don't exist in isolation. And, it's become even more radical now at the time when all these, political barriers are going up, with Fortress Europe, America, and all of this kind of things. So it's outrageous, and it fills me with sadness to know that, what we're doing now is more radical now than it was back in the 80s or the 90s. But I think, culture, ideas, artists rely on that flow. And I think that's what Triangle keeps doing it. But rather than creating a homogeneous voice, is about maintaining a very heterogeneous context whereby every space speaks from their own basis, their own ground. I don't know if that kind of sums it up.
It absolutely does. And I think it's always important to ask questions that you don't know the answers to. And I didn't know the full history of Triangle. So I'm
In fact, Gasworks is a copy of the Back Factory. So, the Back Factory, which was the space,
in
the
South
space
Africa.
in Johannesburg, set up by David Koloane and Bill Ainsley, was such a success because the model was to bring local artists, but also be a space where international artists would go, all about making, all about process, and it works so well. And in Europe, there weren't these kind of spaces, and that's what Gasworks sort of like. Okay, we can copy them. It's working there, and then it evolved across the world.
So I want to come on to the idea of collaboration and kindred spirits, because again, when you're speaking about Paul Ricard, for instance, and this need and his own artist spirit being nurtured not by acquiring work, but by sharing the resource that he had and recognizing a need for other artists. What you're saying about the wider Triangle Network, certainly everything that you've brought to bear in such an inspiring first hour, it seems like it's so important, like just crucial for artists to be seen by other artists. And I was very touched by the moment that you spoke about in Venice of Theaster Gates and Steve McQueen seeing you as an artist and having that kindred spirit. And I guess in the absence of people maybe having an organization that's part of Triangle or a fondation like Pernod Ricard, where there's also the library and a cafe where people can have like a delicious meal at a good price. You know,
Everything is free to the public, which is very important. Everything that we do, the exhibition, the lecture, the
and that's very
debates, the
rare
public program.
in Paris. So I think in the absence of that, where some people are seeking that, I guess there's also a question to be asked, and I guess I will, you know, in some ways put it to each of you, whether you have any thoughts on how one finds those kindred spirits, or, you know, if you want to be like a magnet and have like the iron filings come to you, but in the absence of that, does everyone have to try to create their own, or are there ways for artists to find themselves in places where these things don't exist?
Well, I guess in our case, the art school in Kumasi, because we have Alessio was talking about Castro. So these are my professors from the university, which I kept in touch with all of them. Like I think in about 2 months, I'm aiming to graduate with my PhD. So I've been with them with the university for
It's
quite.
because you're not very busy, so I guess you had time
At
to do a
all.
PhD on top of everything else.
At all. I really don't have anything to do. Yeah, but it's also because for the longest period, the reason why I started a PhD in 2015, 2 years after I finished the master's, but I just didn't, I wasn't doing the PhD for academic reasons. I was doing it because it kept me closer to the community. Because anytime I have any idea, I will call my professors in school because they are honest. I will say, oh, I have this idea, I want to buy this train. Everyone would tell me, no, don't do it. But they will say, yes, do it. I guess because maybe they are teachers, and typically teachers don't get paid enough already. So the concept of money is different, you know, what you to do with money. But again, I really like this idea that there are people like we have Bernard Akwe Jackson, who's an artist from Ghana. So he's one of the teachers at the school. Of course, we have Caricature Seidu, who's there. We have Georgian Prechum. For a long time, we had just one woman who was teaching at the university, Dorothea Menuke. She's an artist. And yes, she's one of the artists that we're working with at the Fondation Cartier for the show. And yeah, we also have a lot of younger artists, Ajoki Say and Kwesi Oheniaye Ayubi, who also like at Gasworks. Yeah, so there are different generations, but it's also what the university managed to, like the founding of Black Star Lines, the idea that artists, professors are like, we could just come together in order to share ideas. Because before that, there were no, I remember when we were students, professors, they always asked us to go to town and go and look for spaces that we could organize our own exhibitions. Because there were no exhibition spaces, there's no museum or anything. So how do you organize an exhibition? So some of my colleagues would go to the cemetery to do their exhibitions. Some of us went to the market. Some people, there was one girl in our class who was really radical. She organized her exhibition in a what's the name, in a bus. Because, you know, like a lot of, most of the buses are mostly driven by men. Most is just men. And then she and her roommates, they rented a bus and then they operated it for a whole day as the exhibition. And yeah, so it was really quite interesting, the idea that so we all used to discuss these ideas. But I think it's one of the things that we had to learn from that period, at least from people like Caricature and Castro and others, was this element of generosity. The idea that even as artists, as we're building, why not work with each other? Because we're not competing, you know? We're trying to build a system or trying to build something. So even when we did the first exhibition at SCCA, the Savannah Center, when it was opening, it was all my colleagues from Kumasi, Caricature, even all the lecturers, they came. And the students were the carpenters. They built the exhibition sets and everything. And before that, we did a trilogy of exhibitions in Accra, the National Museum, and a couple of other shows. And the students would come together in order to build their own shows. Of course, some people would have to contribute money, some others labor, and then we'd have to negotiate here and there. But the question is that we have to be able to build a system together that would help us in order to be able to understand better what we're dealing with.
Something that is fundamentally generative rather than competitive.
Yes, exactly. It's very important.
But also, so if I may interject, also something that, you know, makes it very clear that art doesn't necessarily exist in a white cube. In fact, it doesn't. Art is something generative that happens in the context that generates it, reflects it. So it's a much more circular situation that we're describing in this. And that's what's nice about, if I think back of conversations that we've had with artists within the Triangle Networks, this idea of need, this idea of like creating something that communicates, creating something that it encourages discussions, that is part of the market where the ideas come from. It feeds back to it, because who is art for? Of course, artists are people, live in society, and that's what sort of generates and reflects back.
And maybe it's important to interject there that at Gasworks, when artists come for the residency, similar to that kind of starting spark in upstate New York, that there's not a mandate to produce something at the end.
Yeah. One of the things that I always used to say, and I'm sure Ibrahim remembers, is that, the studio for the artists that we bring into London is London. The studio is just where you go and deposit your books, you write down some things, but actually we want artists to be able to be around other people and to use the city as a resource, because it is a resource.
And so, Antonia, I want to bring you back into the conversation. We've had the privilege of co-commissioning the film by Arash Nassiri, A Bug's Life, not the Pixar one, even better one. But there are ways to think about what it means to help initiate something. And I wonder if you would speak to that.
Yes, of course. I think when we speak about a philanthropic engagement, I mean, we are not a museum, we're not in the art market. So it kind of comes with a sort of like freedom, but also responsibility. And what we try to do in a very humble way, as you were saying, for me, the very important values at the foundation are this generosity, this what we call conviviality, this offer a space where artists, curators, they can meet each other, they can discuss, and slowly, sometimes also in a kind of like a certain way, but this is also part of the process. I mean, the aim is not to produce something. This is also why very recently we opened a space that is called Aberto, which is a space that works like the residency in Gaswork. It's really a space where artists, curators, authors, they have time to do their research and production to produce something is not the mean of the idea of this process. Going back to your question, I think that what we try to do is not going outside, as Alessio was saying, of the white cube, and also Paris being the only center in a kind of way. And so we try also to establish a kind of like system of alliance with other institutions, with other associations, try to build projects together in a kind of like sustainable way. This is also why we started our collaboration. And it's not just co-producing a show, because what we did was really like doing a research together as two separate institutions, share the way we work, the team working together on a long period of time, almost 2 years, and meeting so many artists, discussing with them, engaging in critical discourse, and then supporting an artist in this journey of producing a film that now is visible at Chisenale, soon at the Fondation Pernod Ricard. So the idea is to try to establish different like kind of way of ecosystem of working together as institution. Of course, in times that are very challenging. And there is something that I wanted to ask to you, Ibrahim. You were talking about value, materials that carry values. And of course, this artist, centered space that we try to run are also not neutral. They are related to power, to resources, to history. And I was wondering, how do you interact with an institution when they invite you, you know, for a show, producing with an exhibition, and considering this not like a kind of sort in term or an appropriation of what you're doing? I don't know if the question is clear.
No, no, it's a very valid question. It's one of the things that we constantly thinking about. Of course, the show that we're having at the Cartier, it was one of the things that we had to like really take time to really understand, because when the invitation came from Chris Durkin and he made a trip to the studio in Tamale because he somehow wanted to understand how like this works. Of course, the idea was, because I, as an artist, of course, you have to work from your own perspective and your own point of view. But certainly, I'm not one that, it's not about the singularity of the artist. It's more or less about what you can bring and how that opens up a platform for others. And that's what we've done with the idea of building the studio and everything that it comes with. So certainly, the idea was that, okay, fine, we're going to do a solo exhibition or whatever, but how do we build this exhibition? And this is, I think it's quite successful in this way, but how do you build this exhibition in such a way that it's reflective of the ideas that somehow empower what we're working on? So that's where James Bano, Dorothea Manuke, Zoro Poku, the CATPC, that's the plantation workers from Congo. Yeah, there's an Afghan artist called Feda Wata. And then there is a Ghanaian architect, Courage Podo. And yeah, a couple of, yeah, I think that's it. And maybe I've forgotten. There is an artist from Slovenia, Tia Sharena. Yeah, so the idea was how to reconstitute the space in such a way that it's somehow reflective of some of these ideas that we're working on. But of course, sometimes also when you're invited to work with institutions, it's also just, the idea is just to produce a show. It's as straightforward as it is, because we're also grappling with the contradictions of capital also, which is circulating within the art world. And for me, it was very important in the beginning just to stick with it, because back in Ghana, we don't have access to anything, you know. If we don't have access to grants or any of those things. And we don't even, even at my studio, we don't even have access to like a pipe for drinking water, you know. The things that we take for granted, because when you live in the West, and there are certain things about life which is guaranteed. There's a road that goes to your house. Yeah, but in Africa, you have to watch where you walk on the road before you step in a pothole. So all those things, the idea of negotiating in between to think about how that comes together to like somehow build this thing that we're calling some kind of an institution, which might have a residency, might have a library, a cinema, or all these other things, a cultural, archival repository of whatever it is. All these things, the question is that how does that translate into, let's say, if you're working with an institution beyond, yeah, especially within the Western context. And for me, always like to think about that it's a question of negotiating, because a lot of these institutions that you work with also, they're also very limited in their capacity. Because sometimes with the kind of work that we're doing in Ghana, there are a lot of institutions that they cannot begin to imagine and deal with the gravity of the work that you do on that scale. The only way they can deal with it is maybe an extracted version, which maybe can hang. But if we have to, for instance, if you're even working in the Tate, the space exists or wherever, and then you have to respond to it. Whereas where we're coming from, we have to build the entire system from scratch. We even have to build the power grid. We have to build the pipeline. Yeah, so it's a very different notion of living, you know? And I think that what makes it interesting is that when the institution is open to it politically, and also they can be quite sensitive to like the notions of how artists like us, how we operate, and how that also teaches them different ways in which they can think about redistribution of resource. So it's not so much about just doing big blockbuster spectacular exhibitions, but if you have, let's say, for instance, $1 million to do a show, and you're working with artists, for instance, from the Congo and other places, how do you redistribute the resource in such a way that it's not so much about just creating a spectacle within a white cube, but also it is somehow, because we always say that arts is about freedom. And artists, a lot of artists would defend their lives on it. So yes, my work is about freedom, and then, but at the end of the day, a lot of these artworks, they will never find their way in certain parts of the world to the end of time. Yeah. So is that really what freedom is about? No, because at the end of the day, we still want to be able to safeguard certain principles, and then we don't want to risk it. But art is all about risk, because I could have decided to live anywhere in the world, which was working. Because when I went to London many years ago, I even remember when I did the DAD residency in Berlin, a lot of artists would stay in Germany. And a lot of people were disappointed that I left Germany at the time. They were like, how could you live after 1 year? Because you could have stayed and had what's the name, a passport. Because even recently I was detained at the airport in Italy because I was teaching in the university in Bolzano, and they offered me like a residence permit and blah, blah. And I didn't take it. And they didn't understand why. Why? Like, because I'm black, coming from West Africa, and their whole notion is that if you're black coming from West Africa, you want to stay here. And I said, I'm sorry, this place is not as wonderful as you think it is, you know. And you have to make up your mind, you know. One, you don't want us here, but then you're very selective about who you want to be here. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I cannot. Where I'm coming from is so precarious, but I believe that I'm one of those people who can somehow reinterpret that precarity and convert it into something else. Yeah, so why not do that? And I think sometimes institutionally, that's what maybe the Western institutions can take that position, because you have to admit that there is a huge amount of capital that is within the Western context. Yeah, so the question is, how do you work with that capital? Is it just about doing big exhibitions, or it's about finding new ways in which those capitals are redistributed in such a way that it creates different kinds of distribution systems around the world? And I think that's where the question of restitution and all this becomes difficult. Because people say, oh, yes, like the British Museum, no, it is ours to keep. I said, yeah, but no. I'm like, it doesn't work that way. Even if you have to even give the objects back, it's not just about the objects themselves. It's about money also, human capital. You have to train people. You have to bring, and of course, with the projects that you guys are doing, that's the embodiment of it, how to share. And it's very important to think about that.
That was actually my next question for all of us to think about, was this notion of precarity. And so much of what not only you've just said, but what you said earlier felt like not only a potential roadmap, but also this call to action, and for us to think very thoroughly about what it means to be engaged in this work now, in this time where, you know, to speak about geopolitical volatility is to say the absolute least. But this notion that, again, this fundamental contradiction that art is both something that means so much, but that, you know, we can potentially live without. We wouldn't want to, but how we negotiate these things that relate so much to usurious labor practices, to these kind of imbalances in power. And so I guess it's not a fully formed question, but it's just something for us to think about together. So Alessio, can I kick that back to you?
I mean, when I think about precarity, I think that the whole principle of triangle is based on precarity. You know, things happen when there is money, and they don't happen when there isn't any, but they don't die. They just, there's pause. You know, I always think of the network almost as a breathing organism. You know, when you get a lot of air, you breathe in and you deliver a lot of things. And when there isn't enough air, you just stay there, but you don't necessarily die. And that's kind of the beauty. And it goes back to what you, Ibrahim, you were saying, this idea of how do you customize all the time, because you're not, you know, if we were to export gasworks across the world, we would have failed within 2 days, because gasworks fits London. You know, your project fits Tamale. I think it's about that. It's finding the principle that connects us, but delivering it in ways that make sense in your context. And I think that that's what keeps it alive. It's still precarious, but you can work with precarity rather than being paralyzed by it. And I think that that's, in my mind, has been the key for the network. You know, we're going through a moment within the network of huge precarity because funding is very restricted. There's a lot of fear about funding, where it goes, who it goes to, what artists are saying. You know, on the one side, art is that little thing that happens over there, and yet people are so scared of art because
Threatened
it
by
can
it.
say, yes, because art can say things that other spaces can't say. So how do we use the precarity to our advantage is something that I certainly think about. It doesn't mean that I'm still not seeking funding to be able to do more, but I'm also saying that, you know, that precarity doesn't mean paralysis. For me, these are really essential tenets.
And maybe that's a helpful thing for us to think about as well, for us to, if it's possible within capitalist framework, to disentangle the money from it, because we also know that there are institutions with lots of money that don't make good shows or that don't do something that feels urgent or necessary in the world. Like you were saying about, you know, it's possible to make something that is self-indulgent or that, you know, effectively misses the mark. And there are times when, not to fetishize a lack, but without the adequate resources, that many ingenious things end up being brought to bear. So there are ways to think outside of these frameworks, but again, within a context where, as Ibrahim, you've said, I think very eloquently in a number of different ways, you know, to be born Black and in certain parts of the world, it can be a lot harder to be an artist or to be a curator than if you're born in certain other places. So this notion of what it is that is precarious exists in many different like who has a choice to be an artist. There are these lots of different types of questions that underpin what that notion of precarity can be, or who can sustain a practice even. I feel like that's also a part of it. So maybe there's a question there about, in some of the time that remains, what you feel it looks like to help an artist sustain a practice. You know, I'm not saying it's like a Trojan horse thing, but even as you name check the many other artists who are a part of this show at Fondation Cartier, like, to me that is so exciting that, you know, what was presumably initially an invitation to you became again something that, you know, you're wedging the door open and saying, okay, everyone, coming, we're all going to Fondation together. And so I think it's, again, to that first question that I asked when we opened about thinking about strategies. I just wonder if we might spend a few minutes thinking about that. Like, what does it look like from each of your perspectives to help support artists in this time of precarity?
It's a very interesting question. As a private foundation, the chance that we have, and is that we are funded so by the company, and but what is important also is that since the beginning, it's also why we decided that everything that we were doing had to be free to the public and for the artists, for the curator, for the people we engage this discourse with. So, and we try to do it in a very humble way. And the way we work is really to create, I believe, a safe space for the artists. You were talking about risk, but also I think that in an institution we not talk that much about failure, because sometimes you can engage in a progress, but maybe in contemporary art, to fail is not really part of the process making. So when we start working on a project, the way we want to see the foundation is like a safe space where people can meet, they can discuss, we can work on a project together, and with a kind of certain also, in a slowly way, in a kind of sort of uncertainty. But this is also part of what we all try to build together, I think. And yeah, I don't know if it answers.
For me, it's also recognizing, certainly, you know, thinking about the Triangle Network, what we've built over the decades isn't just like a lot of activities and a lot of different dots around the world. We've also built knowledge through that communality. And I think that you were talking about generosity earlier. And, yes, the network doesn't have the money that it did at one point because we got a big grant from America and now that's gone. But what we've built is an immense amount of knowledge and an amazing network where people can help each other. And a lot of times money isn't everything. Sometimes knowing how you've done something, like being inspired by another project, having access to somebody that can guide you through things is extremely valuable. And sometimes it's not considered in that sort of terms because it's not money, but it's a huge resource.
I keep coming back to it. Maybe it seems flippant, but one of the points that I was maybe wanting to end on is food, because I think, again, this notion of like community and what that means, and that sometimes the art that's generated is the byproduct of a good meal or laughing or sharing books. And so for you to bring in, for instance, Chef Khadija, or the kitchen at Gasworks, which I know personally is such a hub of activity, or even the kitchen in the Gasworks residency house, or again, like the fact that on the premises of your place, it's possible to get like a very brilliant lunch, a very good, like these things may feel small, but they're not incidental. They can also be the building blocks that help fuel this different way of thinking, of interrogating how we might do something differently. Are we opening it up to questions? Okay.
Yeah, so we'll open the floor now for any questions. All right, I'll come right over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've come from Malaysia for this. Ghana and Malaysia are astrological twins. We gained nationhood in 1957. So much of your work is a lot about memory. And since independence, we have tried to construct very formal histories by eclipsing memory. My question to you is about your work as subversion. And I find that a lot of, sorry the silly term, but a lot of Western discourse seems to miss the point of subversion in your work. For example, the way you use state apparatus to transport a plane to a place of imagination that they could never go. Also that your work has become a kind of hive for, in your words, white middle-class people. Could you tell me, your approach to this act of subversion, constant subversion?
I don't know. For me, I don't think about it so much. It just comes, it just comes naturally in the thinking because it comes from an intellectual point, from when I was a student. So anytime when I learn about something, like the other day I was talking about the fact that there was this archive, which was someone that hinted me that the archive was under threat and it was going to be destroyed. And they were offering the archive to me. And this is a really important archive. They like the archive of the entire railway network in the region. And ethically, I said, no, this is not right. I cannot take this. We need to go through a process. But I was wrong about that, Sometimes I might not go through that. I would just say, okay, fine, let's do it. But in this case, I was like, no, I don't think this is right because there's something a bit more nuanced about it. But then a few days ago, I got pictures from this place and they had completely destroyed the entire archive, Of course, the archive, the materials themselves were there, but they were damaged, So we've collected everything now, and now we have to go through this process of repairing it. But then we had to work with some of the people who were within the state apparatus in order to be able to save all of this. Yeah. And it just comes back down to the question of responsibility and how we exercise it. Because at the end of the day, sometimes we imagine things. When we're not artists, when those ideas come to our minds, we think, oh yes, it's just an idea and we let it go. But we artists, we strive to actualize those ideas in a way, bringing it to life in such a way that it's not just for us, because I don't need to save the archive. I don't have any reason for it to have it. I don't need the trains or the planes, or I don't need to build this institution on this large scale. But you understand what it means when you build it. Yeah, because when I was finishing school again. I remember that one of our professors' caricature was saying that it's important for us to realize that as artists, we can live anywhere. Because mostly a lot of artists would like to live in like the major cities. So like when you come to Ghana, most of the artists live between Accra and Kumasi. But a lot of them come from different places. And the idea has always been to encourage them that why not go and live in your village? Because people always think, oh yes, but people said to me in the beginning, but the people in the village, they don't understand contemporary art. There are no collectors there. And I said, yes, I know there are no collectors there. But in 50 years, in 20 years to come, the kids who are growing up there, you don't know the next person might become the next wealthiest person, and they might become the next collectors. But again, how do we institute that they don't just become capitalists who are like soulless, who don't understand what it means to deal with the world on a cultural level, you know? So because we have to bring through that, the subversion is a political thing. It's an act in itself. By using this in order to build something else, it somehow instills this act of faith within a different population to think that, yes, it is possible to be able to think in this manner, even in this state of precarity when it comes to capital, because you don't have access to anything. There's no money. You're not getting grants. As I said, you don't even have access to drinking water. But does it mean that we should not think culturally? Yeah. So I think there's a quote in the Bible that says that man shall not live by bread alone, you know. So it's not just about food, but it's about the sustenance of the mind and what it means to this ecosystem that we find ourselves in called the planet.
Also, I think you've defined success for yourself in quite a particular way that is not about being subversive to my view, but that you're very intentional about who the audience for art can be, where the assumption is that there's only one art audience and that audience is elsewhere and moneyed and educated and doesn't look like us or whatever it might be, but that actually there are many different art audiences. And just as the art audience in major Western capital cities was cultivated, you know, that appreciation is something that is learned, that can be learned in many different contexts, and we don't have to then only ascribe to a certain mindset where we then think art can only be for certain people. That
Yeah,
you know.
I guess it's a sense of, it's an arrogant way of thinking. And I think for us, that's why people like Max and Benjamin were quite important to our thinking, because you cannot think about the arts in isolation. So for instance, the factory or these things, over the years as they've been used to work, they've been working, they've somehow been absorbing. So like the building, sometimes a machine will hit a part of the building, there's a dent, there are scratches on the wall, there are objects which they're using in the space. Maybe over 50, 60 years, the space is abandoned. And then as an artist, the place is being destroyed, and you use the same capital coming from the art world to acquire this object, and then you build a new work out of it. The thing that inspires the work is that accumulation of time. And so for me, the art is not just the time when the artist makes the work in the studio. You have to trace back all the way. And the moment you begin to trace, that's where the question of justice comes in. So you now think, okay, fine. If I'm making this work based on this historical system, then I don't necessarily think that it is just an object that needs to go somewhere. Of course, maybe a part of it can go to Paris, because at the end of the day, these materials that we're dealing with, they are global, they're part of a global circulation. Of course, they will travel around the world. But the question is that what does it really do with the question of justice in the local context? Because a lot of these kids who are growing up in these places, their grandfathers or uncles or something would have had some kind of connection with these materials. But now that the artist intellectually puts these things together, and then market touches it, the moment the market touches it, then it somehow becomes very clean. So, oh yes, but these people, and it's always frustrated me so much when artists, oh yes, but these people, they don't know how to take care of my work. They don't even appreciate it. But you were not thinking about that when the factory was running, when all the crisis was happening, when the failure was happening, and we're talking about failure. So the failure in itself becomes a material form in order for us to be able to work with and reinterpret, in order to be able to create this kind of renewed condition that we're dealing with.
I think what is also very amazing is the way you're nurturing, you know, you come and this creating, building this community, which becomes also part of your work, but it also yeah, the way you also like bring back history in the way you engage with these materials, with this community participating also, they are part also of what you're doing, yeah.
Thank you for those amazing answers. Does anyone else? All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your inspiring talks. Actually, I really don't have any questions. Actually, I'd rather have comments. And then I'd like to just share quite surprising discovery that I found today. Because I'm a curator at National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, Korea. And then a year ago, I did a huge exhibition of a solution of the retrospective of one Korean artist who did a lot of like experimental art in Korea throughout the 70s to 90s. And then actually he was like the first generation after the Korean War. So he had to kind of build up the contemporary art in that sense. It's quite kind of similar situation in a way. And then actually he traveled to New York and studied, I mean, in New York for 3-4 years. And then he stayed there. And then while he was there, he's keep talking about like he did some residency program in Anthony Caro's like studio or something like that, upstate New York. But his English is not good at all. So he really didn't know what he was involved in. And then, you know, it was like late 80s. And then he was kind of, he kept telling me how he enjoyed the sharing the experience with the other artists, even though they don't talk each other because he doesn't know English. But even so, he kind of kept telling me that he enjoyed that experience. And then he never found out what it was actually. And then turns out it's a triangle thing, definitely. So it was really quite surprising thing for me because you know what? Because you know he was really kind of known not just as an artist, but also he's one of the kind of what can I say, the patron of the Korean contemporary, Korean like experimental art. Because he
Can you say his name?
Oh, his name is Lee Gang-so, and then he's kind of the first generation who he sponsored all those kind of experimental events and performance happening outside Seoul. So he kind of were inspired, of course, as so he's kind of related to the project you did in 80s. And then, you know, while, you know, listening to it also, I could relate that he's kind of what he's been telling me was kind of related to the, you know, Ibrahim's idea. It's like how you could actually, you know, build a contemporary art, and then how do you connect to the people in the region? Not, you know, it's not an adoption from United States, it's not an adoption from the Western arts, and how do you really kind of relate to the local people there throughout the contemporary art? So I could see the whole connection is kind of made today. So thank you very much.
It's nice to hear that because, and it happens a lot that, you know, artists or people that know other people that they've been in Triangle and they come and tell me and they expect me to react like, you must know that. And it's like, we estimated that about 5,000 artists went through the Triangle Network. And one of the things that I think is extremely important, because it is such a global network, and I'm the director and I'm sitting in London, but I'm probably the one that knows less about the network. And I think that that's an important thing, because I'm not the point of control. I am not where the knowledge sits. The knowledge is around the world. And that's why, you know, going back to a question you asked earlier, you know, Triangle is different. Every manifestation is different. Every hub holds its knowledge and then speaks from it. And so these stories are amazing because it just reminds us that this is, you know, the generosity comes in that you provide a platform where artists and the public, because, you know, every activity, even though the network has always worked, it's an artist to artist, peer to peer, et cetera, there's always a public outcome, there's an open day, or there's a mini exhibition or whatever. So, it is much more porous than perhaps I described it earlier. But it's also about creating conditions and then allowing people, and you don't have to control that. It has its own life, and that's something very beautiful.
I know you're not normally meant to define things by like its opposite, but I'm realizing that everything we've been talking about here today is the antithesis of entitlement.
I have a question.
Please.
My question is more for the other three panelists, but it is regarding Ibrahim. I mean, we've seen Ibrahim's meteoric rise in the art world, and obviously he's a absolutely brilliant artist, conceptualist. But what struck me the most today was his elegant generosity and authenticity and humility that comes across immediately when you start speaking. And I wanted to ask the three of you who are curators and directors of institutions, how important is that in contributing to the success of Ibrahim, not just his brilliance?
So I discovered him.
You did not, I know that.
I was the first.
It's a good question because, again, Ibrahim came to do a residency at Gasworks 12 years ago, and he was 26, 27 at that time.
Oh, can I also say something? The first time I mentioned Ibrahim to Alessio, he said, Ibrahim is one of my children.
Yes.
And he is the nicest person you will ever meet. And Zoe has said that to me as well. And every other person who knows you says that to me.
Okay.
So I just want to talk about how important that is.
I think for you're right, and I still think of him as one of my. But I think of everybody who's been through Gasworks and Triangle as my children, and I say that because the way because affection is part of my curatorial, my directorial thing. I spent 3 months with all these artists, or even sometimes longer time. And you know them as people, you know them as interlocutors, you know them, you create a space for them, but they create a space for you. If I think about, I worked at Gasworks for 26 years, and for all that time, every artist that would come to Gasworks would show me London in a way that I hadn't seen. And I lived there for decades, not all my life, but the best parts of it. So I think what you could do when you're working particularly with emerging artists or thinking of Ibrahim, I didn't know what he was going to do during the residency, but I think you just create opportunities and then you let them develop. And I think you do that for artists, but I think when these things work is when the artists do that for you. It's amazing to keep seeing Ibrahim after all these years because we keep bumping into each other, or he comes to London, or and you kind of check in and you just reconnect through those points where you share ideas or you inspire each other. I don't know. I just think there's a lot of mutuality in the way we work with artists.
That's the
when you
word.
create those spaces.
I was going to say reciprocity.
Yes.
So I
And,
remember,
and trust also, yeah.
yeah, but even, I almost think about it the other way. Like that first time I went to Kumasi, you and Benjamin Okante were like big brothers. Like they wouldn't leave me at my hotel, even though the hotel's perfectly fine. I traveled, I wasn't worried. And they were like, no, we're going to wait for everybody else to get here and for you to have your key. And there were just these various moments where the care and concern for other people extends beyond a transactional, will there be a show out of it or something, that there is that sense that, if you are genuinely there to learn, then even as one acknowledges power dynamics that exist between, someone in an institutional position of power and an artist in a different position, what that means for there to be curiosity and a desire to learn from each other, I think is a very important mainstay. And I think that what I've seen in your practice in a way that translates in ways that not every practice can or does is, we were joking outside with Clementine about you being kind of so many different places in the world at any given point, but there's a register and a way that your ability to work with materials and to work with other people is translatable in a manner that doesn't necessarily require, certainly doesn't require curatorial theory or any dressing up. You don't have to gild a lily in order to grasp something fundamental about the work and where it's coming from. And that ability means that it can be not just apprehended or kind of understood conceptually, but felt very deeply across such a wide range of people looking at it and being part of it.
Would anyone else like to ask a question?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It's something to talk about. I wanted to bring in the public art projects happening around the world. Especially, I come from South Asia, India, and thank you for Triangle Art Foundation. I've been a part of COAJ for a long time. But the space for public art projects has actually shrunk, even though a lot of funding has come in. And a lot of funders are being very careful of what is being shown as public art projects. So how the possibilities there to kind of reclaim spaces for artists to actually subvert or to bring in other discourses within the public art space, because now it has become an extremely safe space. The public space is too safe. People are not wanting to say anything, they don't do anything, and the funders are not so-called allowing them to say what they wanted to say.
Am I? I don't really know how to answer that question. I think I was talking earlier about the triangle network being almost like a breathing organism, so that it's contract and expands according to needs, and well, it's not even to needs, according to resources. And I think I agree with you that the spaces for freedom, whatever that is, and it's difficult to are shrinking, but I think the need for dialogue and the desire to still have this conversation is there. We just need to connect the dots a lot of the time, or just make sure that even though you might need to be quiet, because you also shouldn't, just because you have something to say doesn't mean you have to lose your life over it. And, I respect that. So I think things might have to shrink down. Maybe we need to have smaller conversations, maybe the safe spaces are less, but they're not disappearing. I think we need to also believe that these things can continue to move. That's what I was saying earlier about precarity. And you could talk about precarity even as freedom, or spaces for dialogue being precarious and therefore kind of folding for a moment. But I think you really need to keep thinking that there's a possibility things will continue to evolve, because the minute you could shrink down, but it's paralysis and death that is the problem. While you're still alive, there's still time, there's still room, there's still opportunities. You might find different ways. And that's the beauty of art. And I think that's what I learned from artists, that, when you say that something is impossible, then they tell you, that's why I want to do it. And that gives me hope. So that's what I kind of hold on to.
And Ibrahim, you had the quote in your sketchbook about, I'm not going to get it exactly right, but about exhuming history, even if that meant you had to engage with this rotting corpse. And I wanted to give the word to you.
Okay, yeah. No, I think it's quite interesting. I agree with everything that Alessio said, and certainly, as artists, when we have ideas, sometimes you somehow also limit yourself in a way. The public space is very important. I think one of the things, I was having this conversation with people, because people always say that, oh yes, but it's really good, like the kind of work that we do as artists, as private individuals. And maybe we're doing it and the state doesn't really need to do it. But I always thought that, no, it's not right. The state needs to be to do it. Because when something happens on the funding level from the states or like commissions and other things, it somehow reinstitutes faith within the general public and citizens, because at the end of the day, it comes back down to all of our collective like labor and efforts and everything. Whereas sometimes if it's just done from an individual point of view, both from an artist point of view and also for like say institutional from a collector or whatever, sometimes it can also be seen in a very different way. Um, so for me, it's very important. We somehow need to go back to the question of the collective, and the collective goes back to the question of the public realm. Of course, maybe my strategy has been how to rebuild, like because my work, there's a large range of critique within the work that I produce, and sometimes when you collect or you produce something, when I produce a certain work, I just keep the work in the studio. There are so many works I've produced over the last years, countless number of works which have never been shown before. Sometimes I even forget they exist, and then I'm going through the studio and I'm like, of course, some of them you cannot forget they exist because they're always there, they're so large. But there are some of them that they're smaller drawings or something that you made, and then they're just tucked somewhere. And then every once in a while you bring them out and you're like, oh, it's quite interesting, you know. But some of them, not because you didn't think that they were right, but you didn't think that sometimes you just keep them to yourself. And I think that's also the thing about artists also and how we operate. Because sometimes, yeah, we know that we can say something, but we have to say it, you know, or maybe, yeah, we can say it in a very different form. Maybe we can spend more time maybe having conversations with one another. And I think if you, even India, like you have the Kochi biennial, and as precarious as it is, they've kept it going all these years. Very precarious, you know. On the day of the opening, we're installing works, you know. But it's beautiful, you know, because I remember when I was there recently, there were like, it's so genuine, and like all the artists are helping one another. Like the curator himself, Nikhil, he's an artist, so he understands, like we're going to places, we're eating together, we are discussing these things. As some things are working, some things are not working, but at least you understand that these guys are committed to something, you know. They're committed to building something. And I also like, I think the student biennial, which is also happening there, is unlike anything happening anywhere else in the world. I remember a few years ago when I was the artistic director for the Ljubljana Graphic Art Biennial, I spent so much time just going to different schools in the region, just sharing ideas and things. And at the end, I said, apply to the biennial. And then the students applied to the biennial. We selected some of the students as part of the artists for the biennial. Yeah, but when I came to Kochi and I realized that there was a biennial just for the students, I was like, wow, like you wouldn't find this many parts in the world. Of course, there are some editions of Venice where like there are curators who are committing part of the resource into like creating the kind of programs that you guys are here for, like talking to artists, mentorships, and things like that. And I think that there is a certain sense of generosity, particularly within this region. India, like a lot of the artists that I've met, they are so generous in their spirits and in terms of how they produce and how they share, how they speak to one another. It's not like that in many parts of the world. It's very frustrating, honestly. I've always thought that artists, we have the capacity to offer something really great to the world, but sometimes you meet artists and you become very frustrated because of a lot of artists, they like to, very close, they like to keep things. It's almost as if they have a trade secret. And I said, no, that's why we make art. It's the last point. It's the only safe space in the world. If everything else fails, art must not fail.
Thank you. Thank you to all our speakers. It was truly an engaging morning, and thank you for sharing all of your insights and knowledge on this discussion. May I kindly invite you to remain on stage and for May to join us as well to present a token of appreciation. And we'd love to take a little photo as well. So this brings us to the conclusion of the second edition of Basecamp. If you've heard from May, we warmly invite you to explore Art Outreach Singapore's other programs and offerings. There's so much more to do this afternoon and evening. For example, gather at Gilman. We're opening a bunch of different galleries all across the precincts until 10 p.m. There's going to be food, a lot of art. There's going to be a block party. So I hope to see all of you there and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all for coming.